The Anthropologist as Hero by Susan Sontag. The paradox is irresoluble. The less one culture communicates with another, the less likely they are to be corrupted, one by the other. But on the other hand, the less likely it is in such conditions that the respective emissaries of these cultures will be able to seize the richness and significance of their diversity. The alternative is inescapable. Either I am a traveller in ancient times, and faced with prodigious spectacle which would be almost entirely unintelligible to me, and might, indeed, provoke me to mockery or disgust. Or I am a traveller of my own day, hastening in search of a vanished reality. In either case I am the loser. For today, as I go groaning among the shadows, I miss, inevitably, the spectacle that is now taking shape. From Tristes Tropiques by Claude Levi-Strauss. Most serious thought in our time struggles with the feeling of homelessness. The felt unreliability of human experience, brought about by the inhuman acceleration of historical change, has led every sensitive modern mind to the recording of some kind of nausea, of intellectual vertigo. And the only way to cure this spiritual nausea seems to be, at least initially, to exacerbate it. Modern thought is pledged to a kind of applied Hegelianism, seeking itself in its other. Europe seeks itself in the exotic, in Asia and the Middle East, among pre-literate peoples, in a mythic America. A fatigued rationality seeks itself in the impersonal energies of a sexual ecstasy or drugs. Consciousness seeks its meaning in unconsciousness. Humanistic problems seek their oblivion in scientific value neutrality and quantification. The other is experienced as a harsh purification of self. But at the same time, the self is busily colonizing all strange domains of experience. Modern sensibility moves between two seemingly contradictory, but actually related impulses: surrender to the exotic, the strange, the other, and the domestication of the exotic, chiefly through science. Although philosophers have contributed to the statement and understanding of this intellectual homelessness, and, in my opinion, only those modern philosophers who do so have an urgent claim on our interest, it is mainly poets, novelists, a few painters who have lived this tortured spiritual impulse, in willed derangement and in self-imposed exile, and in compulsive travel. But there are other professions whose conditions of life have been made to bear witness to this vertiginous modern attraction to the alien. Conrad in his fiction, and T.E. Lawrence, Saint-Exupéry, Montaiglon, among others in their lives, as well as their writing, created the métier of the adventurer as a spiritual vocation. 35 years ago, Malraux chose the profession of the archaeologist and went to Asia. And more recently, Claude Levi-Strauss has invented the profession of the anthropologist as a total occupation, one involving a spiritual commitment like that of the creative artist, or the adventurer, or the psychoanalyst. Unlike the writers mentioned above, Levi-Strauss is not a man of letters. Most of his writings are scholarly, and he has always been associated with the academic world. At present, since 1960, he holds a very grand academic post, the newly created chair of social anthropology at the Collège de France, and heads a large and richly endowed research institute. But his academic eminence and ability to dispense patronage are scarcely adequate measures of the formidable position he occupies in French intellectual life today. In France, where there is more awareness of the adventure, the risk involved in intelligence, a man can be both a specialist and the subject of general and intelligent interest in controversy. Hardly a month passes in France without a major article in some serious literary journal, or an important public lecture extolling or attacking the ideas and influences of Levi-Strauss. Apart from the tireless Sartre and the virtually silent Malraux, he is the most interesting intellectual figure in France today. So far, Levi-Strauss is hardly known in this country. A collection of previously scattered essays on the methods and concepts of anthropology, brought out in 1958 and entitled Anthropologie Structurale, and his Le Totémisme aujourd'hui, 1962, have been translated in the last year. Still to appear are another collection of essays, more philosophical in character, entitled La Pensée Sauvage, 1962, a book published by UNESCO in 1952 called Tristes et Histoire, and the brilliant work on the kinship systems of primitives, Les structures élémentaires de la parenté. Some of these writings presuppose more familiarity with anthropological literature and with the concepts of linguistics, sociology, and psychology than the ordinary cultivated reader has. But it would be a great pity if Levi-Strauss's work, when it is all translated, were to find no more than a specialist audience in this country. For Levi-Strauss has assembled, from the vantage point of anthropology, one of the few interesting and possible intellectual positions, in the most general sense of that phrase, and one of his books is a masterpiece. I mean the incomparable Tristes Tropiques, a book that became a bestseller when published in France in 1955, but when translated into English and brought out here in 1961, was shamefully ignored. Tristes Tropiques is one of the great books of our century. It is rigorous, subtle, and bold in thought. It is beautifully written, and like all great books, it bears an absolutely personal stamp. It speaks for the human voice. Ostensibly, Tristes Tropiques is the record, or memoir rather, written over 15 years after the event, of the author's experience in the field. Anthropologists are fond of likening field research to the puberty ordeal which confers status upon members of certain primitive societies. Levi-Strauss's ordeal was in Brazil before the Second World War. Born in 1908, and of the intellectual generation and circle which included Sartre, Beauvoir, Merleau-Ponty, and Paul Nizan, he studied philosophy in the late 20s, and, like them, taught for a while in a provincial lycée. Dissatisfied with philosophy, he soon gave up his teaching post, returned to Paris to study law, then began the study of anthropology, and in 1935 went to Sao Paulo as professor of anthropology. From 1935 to 39, during the long university vacations from November to March, and for one period of more than a year, Levi-Strauss lived among Indian tribes in the interior of Brazil. Tristes Tropiques offers a record of his encounters with these tribes, the nomadic missionary murdering Nambiquara, the Tupi Kawahib, whom no white man had ever seen before, the materially splendid Bororo, the ceremonious Caduevio, who produced huge amounts of abstract paintings and sculpture. But the greatness of Tristes Tropiques lies not simply in this sensitive reportage, but in the way Levi-Strauss uses his experience to reflect on the nature of landscape, on the meaning of physical hardship, on the city in the old world and the new, on the idea of travel, on sunsets, on modernity, on the connection between literacy and power. The key to the book is Chapter 6, How I Became an Anthropologist, where Levi-Strauss finds in the history of his own choice a case study of the unique spiritual hazards to which the anthropologist subjects himself. Tristes Tropiques is an intensely personal book. Like Montaigne's essays and Freud's interpretation of dreams, it is an intellectual autobiography, an exemplary personal history in which a whole view of the human situation, an entire sensibility, is elaborated. The profoundly intelligent sympathy which informs Tristes Tropiques makes other memoirs about life among pre-literate people seem ill at ease, defensive, provincial. Yet sympathy is modulated throughout by a hard-won impassivity. In her autobiography, Simone de Beauvoir recalls Levi-Strauss as a young philosophy student-teacher, expounding, in his detached voice and with a deadpan expression, the folly of the passions. Not for nothing is Tristes Tropiques prefaced by a motto from Lucretius's De Rerum Natura. Levi-Strauss's aim is very much like that of Lucretius, the Greekophile Roman who urged the study of the natural sciences as a mode of ethical psychotherapy. The aim of Lucretius was not an independent scientific knowledge, but the reduction of emotional anxiety. Lucretius saw men as torn between the pleasure of sex and the pain of emotional loss, tormented by superstitions inspired by religion, haunted by the fear of bodily decay and death. He recommended scientific knowledge, which teaches intelligent detachment, equanimity. Scientific knowledge is for Lucretius a mode of psychological gracefulness. It is a way of learning to let go. Levi-Strauss sees man with a Lucretian pessimism, and a Lucretian feeling for knowledge as both consolation and necessary disenchantment. But for him the demon is history. not the body or appetites. The past, with its mysteriously harmonious structures, is broken and crumbling before our eyes. Hence the tropics are triste. There were nearly 20,000 of the naked, indigent, nomadic, handsome Nambiquaras in 1915, when they were first visited by white missionaries. When Levi-Strauss arrived in 1938, there were no more than 2,000 of them. Today they are miserable, ugly, syphilitic, and almost extinct. Hopefully, anthropology brings a reduction of historical anxiety. It is interesting that Levi-Strauss described himself as an ardent student of Marx since the age of 17. Rarely do I tackle a problem in sociology or ethnology without having first set my mind in motion by reperusal of a page or two from the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, or the Critique of Political Economy. And that many of Levi-Strauss's students are reported to be former Marxists, come as it were to lay their piety at the altar of the past, since it cannot be offered to the future. Anthropology is necrology. Let's go and study the primitives, say Levi-Strauss and his pupils, before they disappear. It is strange to think of these ex-Marxists, philosophical optimists if ever such have existed, submitting to the melancholy spectacle of the crumbling prehistoric past. They have moved not only from optimism to pessimism, but from certainty to systematic doubt. For, according to Levi-Strauss, research in the field, where every ethnological career begins, is the mother and nursemaid of doubt, the philosophical attitude par excellence. In Levi-Strauss's program for the practicing anthropologist in structural anthropology, the Cartesian method of doubt is installed as a permanent agnosticism. This anthropological doubt consists not merely in knowing that one knows nothing, but in resolutely exposing what one knows, even one's own ignorance, to the insults and denials inflicted on one's dearest ideas and habits by those ideas and habits which may contradict them to the highest degree. To be an anthropologist is thus to adopt a very ingenious stance vis-à-vis one's own doubts, one's own intellectual uncertainties. Levi-Strauss makes it clear that for him this is an eminently philosophical stance. At the same time, anthropology reconciles a number of divergent personal claims. It is one of the rare intellectual vocations which do not demand a sacrifice of one's manhood. Courage, love of adventure, and physical hardiness, as well as brains, are called upon. It also offers a solution to that distressing byproduct of intelligence, alienation. Anthropology conquers the estranging function of the intellect by institutionalizing it. For the anthropologist, the world is professionally divided into home and out there, the domestic and the exotic, the urban academic world and the tropics. The anthropologist is not simply a neutral observer. He is a man in control of and even consciously exploiting his own intellectual alienation. A technique de dépaysement, Levi-Strauss calls his profession in structural anthropology. He takes for granted the Philistine formulas of modern scientific value neutrality. What he does is to offer an exquisite, aristocratic version of this neutrality. The anthropologist in the field becomes the very model of the 20th century consciousness, a critic at home, but a conformist elsewhere. Levi-Strauss acknowledges that this paradoxical spiritual state makes it impossible for the anthropologist to be a citizen. The anthropologist, so far as his own country is concerned, is sterilized politically. He cannot seek power, he can only be a critical dissenting voice. Levi-Strauss himself, although in the most generic and very French way a man of the left, he signed the famous manifesto of the 121, which recommended civil disobedience in France in protest against the Algerian War, is, by French standards, an apolitical man. Anthropology, in Levi-Strauss's conception, is a technique of political disengagement, and the anthropologist's vocation requires the assumption of a profound detachment. Never can he feel himself at home anywhere. He will always be, psychologically speaking, an amputee. Certainly, the earliest visitors to pre-literate peoples were far from being detached. The original field workers in what was then called ethnology were missionaries, bent on redeeming the savage from his follies and making him over into a civilized Christian. To cover the bosoms of the women, put pants on the men, and send them all to Sunday school to mumble the gospel was the aim of an army of stony-eyed spinsters from Yorkshire and raw-boned farmer sons from the American Midwest. Then there were the secular humanists, impartial, respectful, hands-off observers who did not come to sell Christ to the savages, but to preach reason, tolerance, and cultural pluralism to the bourgeois literary public back home. And back home, there were the great consumers of anthropological data, building rationalist worldviews, like Fraser and Spencer and Robertson Smith and Freud. But always anthropology has struggled with an intense, fascinated repulsion towards its subject. The horror of the primitive, naively expressed by Fraser and Levi-Strauss, is never far from the anthropologist's consciousness. Levi-Strauss marks the furthest reach of the conquering of the aversion. The anthropologist, in the manner of Levi-Strauss, is a new breed altogether. He is not, like recent generations of American anthropologists, simply a modest data-collecting observer, nor does he have any axe, Christian, rationalist, Freudian, or otherwise, to grind. Essentially, he is engaged in saving his own soul by a curious and ambitious act of intellectual catharsis. The anthropologist, and herein lies his essential difference according to Levi-Strauss from the sociologist, is an eyewitness. It is sheer illusion that anthropology can be taught purely theoretically. One wonders why a Max Weber writing about ancient Judaism or Confucian China is permissible, if a Fraser describing scapegoat rituals among the Tagbanuana tribe in the Philippines is not. Why? Because anthropology for Levi-Strauss is an intensely personal kind of intellectual discipline, like psychoanalysis. A spell in the field is the exact equivalent of the training analysis undergone by candidate psychoanalysts. The purpose of fieldwork, Levi-Strauss writes, is to create that psychological revolution which marks a decisive turning point in the training of the anthropologist. And no written tests, but only the judgment of experienced members of the profession, who have undergone the same psychological ordeal, can determine if and when a candidate anthropologist has, as a result of fieldwork, accomplished that inner revolution that will really make him into a new man. However, it must be emphasized that this literary-sounding conception of the anthropologist's calling, the twice-born spiritual adventure, pledged to a systematic déracinement, is complemented in most of Levi-Strauss's writings by an insistence on the most unliterary techniques of analysis and research. His important essay on myth in Structural Anthropology outlines a technique for analyzing and recording the elements of myths so that these can be processed by a computer. European contributions to what in America are called the social sciences are in exceedingly low repute in this country, for their insufficient empirical documentation, for their humanist weakness for covert cultural criticism, for their refusal to embrace the techniques of quantification as an essential tool of research. Levi-Strauss's essays in structural anthropology certainly escape these strictures. Indeed, far from disdaining the American fondness for precise quantitative measurement of traditional problems, Levi-Strauss finds it not sophisticated or methodologically rigorous enough. Somewhat at the expense of the French school, Durkheim, Mauss, and their followers, to whom he is closely allied, Levi-Strauss pays lavish tribute throughout the essays in structural anthropology to the work of American anthropologists, particularly Lowy, Boas, and Kroeber. But his nearest affinity is to the more avant-garde methodologies of economics, neurology, linguistics, and game theory. For Levi-Strauss, there is no doubt that anthropology must be a science, rather than a humanistic study. The question is only how. For centuries, he writes, the humanities and the social sciences have resigned themselves to contemplate the world of the natural and exact sciences as a kind of paradise, which they will never enter. But recently, a doorway to paradise has been opened by the linguists, like Roman Jakobson and his school. Linguists now know how to reformulate their problems so that they can have a machine built by an engineer and make a kind of experiment, completely similar to a natural science experiment, which will tell them if the hypothesis is worthwhile or not. Linguists, as well as economists and game theorists, have shown the anthropologist a way to get out of the confusion resulting from too much acquaintance and familiarity with concrete data. Thus the man who submits himself to the exotic to confirm his own inner alienation as an urban intellectual ends by aiming to vanquish his subject by translating it into a purely formal code. The ambivalence towards the exotic, the primitive, is not overcome after all, but only given a complex restatement. The anthropologist, as a man, is engaged in saving his own soul, but he is also committed to recording and understanding his subject by a very high-powered mode of formal analysis, what Levi-Strauss calls structural anthropology, which obliterates all traces of his personal experience and truly effaces the human features of his subject, a given primitive society. In La Pensée Sauvage, Levi-Strauss calls his thought anecdotique et géométrique. The essays in structural anthropology show mostly the geometrical side of his thought. They are applications of a rigorous formalism to traditional themes: kinship systems, totemism, puberty rites, the relation between myth and ritual, and so forth. A great cleansing operation is in process, and the broom that sweeps everything clean is the notion of structure. Levi-Strauss strongly dissociates himself from what he calls the naturalistic trend of British anthropology, represented by such leading figures as Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown. British anthropologists have been the most consistent proponents of functional analysis, which interprets the variety of custom as different strategies for producing universal social ends. Thus Malinowski thought that empirical observation of a single primitive society would make it possible to understand the universal motivations present in all societies. According to Levi-Strauss, this is nonsense. Anthropology cannot aim to understand anything more than its own proper subject. Nothing can be inferred from an anthropological material for psychology or sociology, for anthropology cannot possibly get complete knowledge of the societies it studies. Anthropology, the comparative study of structures rather than functions, can neither be a descriptive nor an inductive science. It occupies itself with only the formal features which differentiate one society from another. It has properly no interest in the biological basis, psychological content, or social function of institutions and customs. Thus, while Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown argue, for example, that biological ties are the origin of and the model for every kinship tie, structuralists like Levi-Strauss, following Kroeber and Lowy, emphasize the artificiality of kinship rules. They would discuss kinship in terms of notions which admit of mathematical treatment. Levi-Strauss and the structuralists, in short, would view society like a game, which there is no right way to play. Different societies assign different moves to the players. The anthropologist can regard a ritual or a taboo simply as a set of rules, paying little attention to the nature of the partners, either individuals or groups, whose play is being patterned after these rules. Levi-Strauss's favorite metaphor or model for analyzing primitive institutions and beliefs is a language. The analogy between anthropology and linguistics is the leading theme of the essays in structural anthropology. All behavior, according to Levi-Strauss, is a language, a vocabulary, and a grammar of order. Anthropology proves nothing about human nature except the need for order itself. There is no universal truth about the relations between, say, religion and social structure. There are only models showing the variability of one in relation to the other. To the general reader, perhaps the most striking example of Levi-Strauss's theoretical agnosticism is his view of myth. He treats myth as a purely formal mental operation, without any psychological content or any necessary connection with right. Specific narratives are exposed as logical designs for the description and possibly the softening of the rules of the social game when they give rise to a tension or contradiction. For Levi-Strauss, the logic of mythic thought is fully as rigorous as that of modern science. The only difference is that this logic is applied to different problems. Contrary to Mircea Eliade, his most distinguished opponent in the theory of primitive religion, Levi-Strauss argues that the activity of the mind in imposing form on content is fundamentally the same for all minds, archaic and modern. Levi-Strauss sees no difference in quality between the scientific thinking of modern historical societies and the mythic thinking of prehistoric communities. The demonic character which history and the notion of historical consciousness has for Levi-Strauss is best exposed in his brilliant and savage attack on Sartre, the last chapter of La Pensée Sauvage. I am not persuaded by Levi-Strauss's arguments against Sartre. But I should say that he is, since the death of Merleau-Ponty, the most interesting and challenging critique of Sartrean existentialism and phenomenology. Sartre, not only in his ideas, but in his entire sensibility, is the antithesis of Levi-Strauss. With his philosophical and political dogmatisms, his inexhaustible ingenuity and complexity, Sartre always has the manners, which are often bad manners, of the enthusiast. It is entirely apt that the writer who has aroused Sartre's greatest enthusiasm is Jean Genet, a baroque and didactic, an insolent writer whose ego effaces all objective narrative, whose characters are stages in a masturbatory revel, who is the master of games and artifices, of a rich, over-rich style stuffed with metaphors and conceits. But there is another tradition in French thought and sensibility, the cult of aloofness, l'esprit géométrique. This tradition is represented among the new novelists by Nathalie Sorotte, Alain Robbe-Grillet, and Michel Buteau. So different from Genet in their research for an infinite precision, their narrow, dehydrated subject matter and cool, microscopic styles, and among filmmakers like Alain Resnais. The formula for this tradition, in which I would locate Levi-Strauss, as I would put Sartre with Genet, is the mixture of pathos and coldness. Like the formalists of the new novel and film, Levi-Strauss's emphasis on structure, his extreme formalism and intellectual agnosticism are played off against an immense but thoroughly subdued pathos. Sometimes the result is a masterpiece like Tristes Tropiques. The very title is an understatement. The tropics are not merely sad. They are in agony, the horror of the rape, the final and irrevocable destruction of pre-literate peoples taking place throughout the world today, which is the true subject of Levi-Strauss's book, is told at a certain distance, the distance of a personal experience of 15 years ago, and with the sureness of feeling and fact that allows the reader's emotions more rather than less freedom. But in the rest of his books, the lucid and anguished observer has been taken in hand, purged by the severity of theory. Exactly in the same spirit as Robbe-Grillet disavows the traditional empirical content of the novel, psychological social observation, Levi-Strauss applies the methods of structural analysis to the traditional materials of empirical anthropology. Customs, rites, myths, and taboo are a language. As in language, where the sounds which make up words are, taken in themselves, meaningless, so the parts of a custom or a rite or a myth, according to Levi-Strauss, are meaningless in themselves. When analyzing the Oedipus myth, he insists that the parts of the myth, the lost child, the old man at the crossroads, the marriage with the mother, the blinding, etc., mean nothing. Only when put together in the total context do the parts have a meaning, the meaning the logical model has. This degree of intellectual agnosticism is surely extraordinary, and one does not have to espouse a Freudian or a sociological interpretation of the elements of myth to contest it. Any serious critique of Levi-Strauss, however, must deal with the fact that, ultimately, his extreme formalism is a moral choice, and, more surprisingly, a vision of social perfection. Radically anti-historicist, he refuses to differentiate between primitive and historical societies. Primitives have a history, but it is unknown to us, and historical consciousness, which they do not have, he argues in the attack on Sartre, is not a privileged mode of consciousness. There are only what he revealingly calls hot and cold societies. The hot societies are the modern ones, driven by the demons of historical progress. The cold societies are the primitive ones, static, crystalline, harmonious. Utopia, for Levi-Strauss, would be a great lowering of the historical temperature. In his inaugural lecture at the Collège de France, Levi-Strauss outlined a post-Marxist vision of freedom, in which man would finally be freed from the obligation to progress, and from the age-old curse which forced it to enslave men in order to make progress possible. Then, history would henceforth be quite alone, and society, placed outside and above history, would once again be able to assume that regular and quasi-crystalline structure, which the best preserved primitive societies teach us, is not contradictory to humanity. It is in this admittedly utopian view that social anthropology would find its highest justification, since the forms of life and thought which it studies would no longer be of mere historical and comparative interest. They would correspond to a permanent possibility of man, over which social anthropology would have a mission to stand watch, especially in man's darkest hour. The anthropologist is thus not only the mourner of the cold world of the primitives, but its custodian as well. Lamenting among the shadows, struggling to distinguish the archaic from the pseudo-archaic, he acts out a heroic, diligent, and complex modern pessimism.